we're having a very special lightning round seminar with early career researchers. And so if you want to join that, or if you want to share that information, all of that is available on our website. And if you have any other general ideas of different types of things that you would like to talk about, please go ahead and contact either me or Sally through the website or through our emails or on social media. So on to the conversation for today. Today, what we're going to be doing is having a conversation about open science, as well as bias in research. And to guide us through this, we have a very special guest moderator, Michael Wohl. So Dr. Michael Wohl is a professor and graduate chair in psychology at Carleton University in Ottawa. His work focuses on factors that facilitate responsible gambling and means to overcome barriers to behavior change. Some of his recent research includes behavior change, utility of nostalgia for pre-addicted self, and the influence of loyalty program membership on responsible as well as disordered gambling. He's published over 130 peer-reviewed papers, and to facilitate his research, he's received over $5 million in funding from the Canadian as well as international granting agencies. So Michael's got his slides already queued up, so I'm just going to pass the conversation over to him to set things up as well as introduce the rest of our panel. Michael?
Thank you very much, Quill. And thank you, Quill and Sally, for inviting me to moderate this session today. Let me set the stage for today's session. I'm going to set the stage, and then I'm going to introduce our esteemed panel afterwards. In 2011, Daryl Bem published a highly controversial article that claimed to provide evidence for time-reversed causality, which implies that future events can have a causal effect on past events. The article reports 9 experiments with 10 tests of time-reversed causal influence on human behavior with stunning results. The mean effect size, the D of in psi performance across 9 experiments was 0.22. All but one of the experiments yielded statistically significant results. The publication of this article rocked psychology and triggered what's been called a credibility crisis in psychological science. Unforeseen by Bem, the article did not sway psychologists to believe in time-reversed causality. Rather, it made the research community, as well as those outside the research community, doubt other published findings in psychology. It took until about 2016, with failures of mass replication projects, for us to begin to understand just how bad things were and are. By the way, I thank Dr. Gilad Friedman for his talk on this very issue and for sharing his slides publicly, which I've modified for your viewing pleasure here today. So a lot of published research seems to fail to replicate. There's extensive research on what's called power posing. That is when you strike a pose that makes you look powerful, that there's research showing that that you feel more powerful. This research has failed to replicate some famous findings that you'll find in intro psych books, like when you put a pen in your mouth and it forces a smile, that you feel happier. This research has failed to replicate. There was research showing that if you walk slower, that you feel older. And perhaps an area that's received a great deal of attention and particularly pertinent to the field of gambling studies is research showing that self-control is a limited resource, what's called ego depletion. And that research has shown that when we are under cognitive load, that this then impairs self-control. And there's been research on this in the field of gambling studies as well. And so we now are seeing a lot of research showing that research that was conducted in the past on self-control fails to replicate. Now, why is this important for the field of gambling studies? Well, first, the field of gambling studies has lagged behind other fields of study in confronting the issue of replicability. And second, aside from researchers basing many of their research questions on prior research, policymakers in the gambling industry have used the knowledge created by the research community to set policies and practice. One avenue to better our field is by opening up the science that we do. So, there hasn't been necessarily a buy-in right now. And what we're trying to do in this session is to open up this discussion about replicability and open science and what is open science. And today we have an amazing panel here to discuss the potential issues with replicability of research in the field of gambling studies, how industry and researchers can work together to better the science that we do, and whether open science is a panacea. And on the panel today, we have a wonderful group. Okay, first we have Dr. Rachel Volberg, who is an eminent scholar in the field of gambling studies. Her work is focused on gambling legalization and the epidemiology of problem gambling, which has laid the groundwork for much of the public health policies that we have in place the world over. She's currently the principal investigator of two major studies funded by the Massachusetts Gaming Commission that is sure to change how we think about gambling and its impact. Second, we have Dr. Eric Louderback, who is an early career researcher at the Division of Addiction at Cambridge Health Alliance, which is Harvard Medical Teaching Hospital. His work uses algorithms to predict risky gambling behaviors. He also has an active line of research in which he evaluates responsible gambling programs. I'm also proud to call him a collaborator. Along with Debbie LaPlante, we recently published a paper on the very topic that we're going to be discussing today. And I think there's a link to that paper in the liner notes on YouTube. And lastly, but certainly not least, I'll be calling from time to time one of the hosts and founders of the speaking session, Dr. Sally Gainsbury from the University of Sydney. She is a leader in the field of gambling studies who focuses on, among other things, means to minimize the harms associated with online gambling and games and related mental health and public health issues. She's also the editor of arguably the premier journal in our field, International Gambling Studies. So let's start off with Eric. But what I'm going to say is that I'd like to have a free-flowing discussion. So if any member of our panel has any points that you'd like to raise that follows up on the question I ask any one of our panel members, please do speak up. And for all of those people that are out there in cyberspace, I see no need to wait until the end of the session to ask questions. So if there's a point that's made that you'd like clarification, or if you'd like to, if you have a question that you'd like to pose to our panel, please do speak up. I will ask Khalil to keep an eye on the discussion board and let me know if there's any questions that would like to be posed to the panel. So without further ado, Eric. Some of our audience may not be familiar with the concept of open science. Would you please provide our audience with a high-level explanation and discussion about why there has been a push for open science in the past 5 to 8 years in many scientific disciplines? So I'll start off there.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Michael, for the excellent overview of the replication crisis, which motivated this move to open science. And also thank you so much to Khalil, Sally, and the University of Sydney for hosting this phenomenal webinar series. I think it's really great to bring like-minded scholars together and other folks at this time when it's hard for us to get together, obviously, in person at conferences and other activities for disseminating knowledge. Okay, so first I think it's really important to provide a clear definition of open science for the audience. So open science refers to a set of principles and practices that encourage transparency, scientific rigor, replicability, and researcher independence. Following the replication crisis, many researchers, as well as the general public, began to question the validity and reliability of scientific research findings. The reasons that research findings were questionable varied, ranging from outright fabrication of data. We think about the Wakefield study on vaccines and autism, which was eventually retracted from the Lancet, to the use of questionable research practices. So luckily, outright fraud, like this example, in academic research is very rare, but these questionable research practices are far more common. So these practices might include things like hypothesizing after the results are known, which is known as harking, selective reporting of only significant results, also manipulation of analyses to increase statistical significance, which folks may be familiar with as p-hacking. There's also other examples of questionable research practices that I can mention briefly, which actually Michael covered on Bem's research, where he had these logically impossible conclusions that didn't replicate when subjected to external replications. So what's really interesting, I think, about open science is it started with psychology, right? And it was started by the replication crisis in psychology, but it's since moved into other disciplines such as economics, medicine, public health, marketing, and now gambling studies. So obviously, self-reflection is never easy and can invite potential criticism, but the purpose of open science is not necessarily to critique or tear down existing research, but more so to encourage best practices for research going forward. So looking at this slide right here, this includes 8 best practices for open science, which include open data, open notebooks, open peer review, open access, open source code, enhancement of scientific social networks, engagement of citizens in science, and finally, open educational resources. So I'll give just a brief overview of each of these research practices, and I'm sure that these will come up in the discussion. So I'm happy to cover these in more detail as we move on in the presentation. So just briefly, open data refers to posting data sets to public repositories while ensuring the privacy and confidentiality of research subjects. Open notebooks are study notes and experimental scripts that researchers also upload to public repositories. Open peer review expands the peer review process to be either single-blinded or fully open. Open access refers to making study pre-registrations and study manuscripts available to the public without paywalls. And open source code refers to posting analytic code from research projects to public repositories. And then finally, enhancing scientific social networks, engaging citizens in science, and open educational resources all pertain to disseminating scientific findings to the public via interpretable and understandable communication channels. So these channels might include things like Twitter, Facebook, ResearchGate, LinkedIn, or even webinars like the one we're doing today. So these open science practices all contribute to promoting open science as a mode of conducting academic research. And in the past few years, there have been organizations that have been developed, such as the Center for Open Science, which is based at the University of Virginia, as well as the Australia and New Zealand Open Research Network, which provide online platforms to share open science materials, knowledge, and ideas. So what I think is particularly exciting at this juncture in science is the fact that leading journals have started to encourage open science practices by awarding badges that appear in published articles. And IGS, International Gambling Studies, is a great example of a journal that has started to use these open science badges, which indicate whether a research study is pre-registered, whether it has open data, as well as whether the study materials have been made open.
Thank you very much for that, Eric. I'm going to ask both Rachel and Eric, following up on what I've said to start off this session, what that really nice overview, Eric, that you just provided. When we look at the field, what are some of the major issues that you see as being some of the major issues with research that has been conducted in the field of gambling studies? Do you see any problems with what has been done in the past, or what might be happening currently? Maybe we'll start off with Rachel, and then I'll loop back to you, Eric.
Well, so I want to say thank you, first of all, to Sally and Khalil for inviting me onto this webinar series. And Michael, thank you very much for putting me on the spot immediately. Yeah, so I mean, to be honest, this is a relatively new development in the gambling studies field. You know, I've been doing gambling research for more than 30 years. So it's a relatively small part of, or it's a very recent development. And I don't feel like I'm a particularly well-informed person about all of these issues. But I think in terms of, I think your question, Michael, was about, do I see particular problems?
Yes.
And, you know, beyond sort of, you know, how you get funding or how you get resources to do gambling research, which is sort of an area that we may or may not get into tonight or today, there's always been this sort of tension, I think, between the researchers on the one hand, wanting to do good research, and the industry wanting good research that supports what they think is possible and preferable to do, and policymakers and program people who are also looking for good research, but very much for research that you know, supports their activities. And so, you know, access to data, for example. I mean, let's talk about an exercise that we just completed in Massachusetts to conduct a patron survey at the first large resort-style casino that opened up. We went all the way through getting the operator on board and you know, fielding this really wonderful survey. And then when we went to weight the data, the operator apparently suddenly realized what we were about to publish, and really tried very hard to pull the plug on the entire report. So we worked very, very hard to sort of, you know, assure that we would be able to publish the report, and we will be publishing the report in the fall. But it entailed a lot of sort of back and forth, and my role as the principal investigator was basically to sort of say, look, you know, we understand your concerns on the industry side that, you know, there's going to be proprietary data that might get out there. As researchers, we'll do everything we can to protect, you know, the information that you're concerned about. But on the other hand, our responsibility is to our funder, which is the Gaming Commission, and they want this information in order to be able to determine if the law as it was passed is actually meeting the goal that was intended. And so in terms of resources, it sort of like ate an entire 3 months of my life that I could have happily used in other ways. So that's the kind of problem that I've had to, that I've sort of encountered recently.
Well, thank you for sharing. And while I'm putting people on the spot, maybe I could flip it back to Eric, who is knee deep in the open science literature, right? And maybe you can speak to how open science might be able to help the situation that Rachel found herself in, or whether you think that it can.
Yeah, I think, you know, you make some great points, Rachel, about industry funding and just how, you know, researchers need to maintain objectivity and independence regardless of the source of funding. You know, I think, and actually Michael and I mentioned this in the paper that he mentioned at the beginning, but I think the firewall between industry and researchers is crucial. You know, this really allows researchers to maintain their objectivity and independence and autonomy. But I do think that there are specific open science practices that could help this to be successfully implemented. So one that comes to mind is pre-registration, right? So the idea of pre-registration is researchers post a public timestamp document to an online platform like Open Science Framework before they even start the research project. And any change that they make to their methodology or their protocol over time has to be documented with the pre-registration, right? So having a pre-registration out there is going to transparently list any kind of deviation from the plan that might have been impacted by industry funders. So I think that's a key way to sort of maintain this objectivity of researchers who are receiving funding from the industry.
Eric, can I interject for a second? Do you, and I'll ask Rachel and Sally to chime in if you think if you have a point that you'd like to follow up on. But do you think that it's possible, feasible for industry partners to sign on to that pre-registration? So before the study is done, you get commitments from all sides that are made public that this is what's going to transpire, right? So that it becomes even more difficult for partners to kind of step back and say, no, now I'm not going to provide you with the data that I said that I was going to provide you with.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly important to set these guidelines early in any kind of funding relationship. I think that with open science becoming more prevalent and, you know, more accepted, industry is becoming more aware of it. I think it also speaks to the idea of transparency. So just, you know, making sure that any research that's funded by industry is fully transparent. So one of the things we do at the Division on Addiction is we have the Transparency Project, which is a website where we post data sets from industry funded research. And this allows for others to, you know, see like the data that was collected and realize that the researcher independence was maintained. So I think there's that education portion early on, and you know, this doesn't necessarily need to just apply to industry funding. This could apply to any kind of funding body, right, that may try to influence the research findings. So I think open data and pre-registration, open materials can really enhance these relationships and enhance things like transparency and independence.
Rachel, I think were you going to add something? I think I saw your.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of raise an issue that kind of occurred to me as I was listening to Eric make the point about, you know, pre-registration of a research plan. So in Massachusetts, we actually wrote a research plan as part of our proposal. There was a research plan, and then there was a cost proposal. And the entire research plan, we actually have it posted on our website, and we have it, and it's also posted on the Gaming Commission's website. The challenge that we've had in Massachusetts is that, you know, this was originally supposed to be a time-limited 6-year project. So we started the year after, we started the year after the Expanded Gaming Act was passed, and we were supposed to be, you know, sort of ending last year with all of the casinos built, and now we would understand the social and economic impacts of introducing 3 casinos in a relatively small geographic state in the US. What no one anticipated was that it would turn into a much longer study because of how long it took the casinos to actually be built, such that you know, we were just getting ready to field our sort of follow-up population survey to assess the impacts on behavior when the Gaming Commission realized that the state of Massachusetts has a law that says you can't grant a contract for more than 6 years, so we had to go through a reprocurement process. So this is all by way of saying that we had a research plan, and we posted it, but you know, sort of events got in the way. And so my question for Eric is, in terms of pre-registration, would open science basically mean that we would go back to our research plan on a regular basis and update it based on what current conditions we were dealing with?
Yeah, that's exactly what the practices advocate for. So there's actually a formal mechanism in place to amend or adjust pre-registrations. So if we look at like Open Science Framework, for example, this is where we've been posting a lot of pre-registrations. It's really like the standard, I would say, for pre-registering research online, because it gives that timestamp and it shows the exact date and time that it was submitted. So I think that, you know, you can amend the pre-registration over time. The idea is that these changes are public, so you can't, like, for example, amend a pre-registration to only report significant findings or something like that. So it provides an added safeguard, I guess, for some of these what are called researcher degrees of freedom, which are ideas, the idea that researchers might, you know, artificially modify their findings to get more significant results or to portray results in a more positive light.
If I can interject here and maybe bring Sally into the conversation, what challenges, I think there's general agreement among scientists that we need to move to an open science model where we detail our hypotheses before we run the study. We make our data open for other people to double check. Now, what challenges do you think, Sally, we might experience with industry as science moves towards open science? Put another way, are there aspects of open science that you think might be somewhat unpalatable to industry? And then I'll open it up to everyone, maybe to discuss how can we deal with that kind of situation?
Thanks, Michael. I would start by saying it's not just industry. Open science practices are important regardless of the funding body, and I think that's really critical. There's been a lot of focus on industry funding and saying industry has conflicts of interest. However, they are far from being alone. If we look at government funding, particularly where there is income or taxation or ownership directly from the gambling industry, and there's a requirement to regulate and minimize harm, there's definitely conflicts of interest there as well. So I would start by saying these practices are essential for all funding coming from different types of sources. And that's important so that it's very transparent in terms of what the research questions that you're asking are, making sure that they're not being driven by an expected outcome. So for example, it is difficult, particularly this, I mean, the challenges which get into your question are that a lot of researchers just don't know or don't understand. There are some fears. People are concerned that, well, if I have to publish all my data, someone might scoop me. Someone might come in and analyze and report findings before I get a chance to really, mine all the data. But there's ways around that. You can put embargoes on data sets. You can publish the data after you finish. We all have truckloads full of desk drawers of data that we're never going to get back around to looking at. So you start to think a little bit more practically about that, and it's not really a barrier. Ethics is one problem. There are some ethics committees or just practices where you say, I'm going to delete the data or I'm going to keep it confidential. So it is important for ethics committees and for researchers to start getting ethics committees on board with the transparency aspects and ensuring that the data storage is very secure and is put in the ethics application, because obviously it's difficult to, well, impossible really, to retrospectively go back and say, we're going to make it available if it wasn't in the initial application. So it's really about moving forward, educating researchers, especially new researchers. So at our lab, all of our students, regardless of if they've got 3 months to do a project or 3 years to do a project, have to go through these processes. And there are some time-consuming elements. Making sure your data set is accessible means making sure it's clean and pretty and there's a table of what all the variables mean. But in the end of the day, we've found, at least in our experience, that all that effort, the upfront work to really pre-register, to make sure your data is accessible, to make sure that your analyses are very well documented and detailed, will end up being extremely useful and actually save you time towards the end of the research when you're trying to figure out what you needed to do and what exactly the methods were. And certainly when someone comes around 5 years later and says, well, how did you do that? You can go back and have that all documented. So the barriers are about shifting attitudes, putting things in place early and before the research even starts, including in research contracts, and making sure that these practices apply not only for industry data, but for government data or organizations that have specific agendas as well. Really, as much as we can get these practices in place broadly, the field itself will be able to move forward.
Thank you, Sally. There's a couple of questions from the audience, and maybe I'll throw it to Eric to help answer them. One of the questions was about pre-registration. It fails if an author delays the registration after they've done the analyses, then just waits to look at it. Is there a workaround for this? And I think that you've gone some way to addressing this already, but with the question of, can the pre-registration be amended? And yes, and also the timestamps. But maybe I'll let you, Eric, discuss this a little bit more and answer this question.
Yeah, so I think this is an excellent question because it speaks to the idea of the ideal way to conduct open science compared to the actual way that open science is typically conducted. So open science best practices would say that a pre-registration should be posted before even looking at the data. So not before analyzing it, before even looking at the data set itself. Because if you find things in the data set that you hadn't expected, these are supposed to be identified as exploratory findings versus confirmatory findings, which are based on things that you've pre-registered. So kind of a basic answer to that question, I would say, is pre-registration should be posted before any data analysis is conducted. And I think, Sally made a great point about education. I think this is where education about open science comes in. And I think, you know, starting with early career researchers or even researchers in training is a great starting point to instill these best practices.
Thank you, Eric. And I would add, first of all, thank you, Sally, for mentioning that the issue isn't just with industry, right? The industry that there's government that funds research, and so there's pressures on researchers in terms of the questions they ask, etc. We also know that there's been an ongoing debate in the field of gambling studies about the relationship between researchers and industry, particularly industry, but I think the biases and the concerns extend, as Sally said, to perhaps research that's funded by nonprofits and by the government. And where open science can come into play is where you're pre-registering your hypotheses. You're pre-registering your data analytic plan, right? And so the degrees of freedom that researchers have are diminished as a result. So before you go into the study, if you say, I'm going to be asking X question, this is my hypothesis, this is how I'm going to analyze the data, that I think that there's, I think that undermines some of the arguments against researchers collaborating or working with industry. Sally, maybe I could ask you if you have any thoughts on what I just noted, and then Rachel and Eric after that.
Sure, and I will mention as well that at International Gambling Studies, we have now, as you've alluded to, Michael, introduced open science policies and practices. And that's really important, not just about the funding issue. And I think that this is certainly an important topic, but there's a lot of other issues about open science practices and data and research integrity and what open science practices can solve in some ways towards those issues. And it's getting into that replication crisis that you mentioned earlier. So as journal editors, we were concerned, we went back and forth a little bit thinking, well, if we make this a requirement that people have to include these statements, and at this stage, we're at almost the lowest level. So, I mean, that's great that we're getting acknowledged for this, but we've got a long way to go in terms of being, you know, best practice, because we recognize it's a stepping stone. And part of what we want to do for IGS, what we do is we require people to have statements. You know, is your publication pre-registered? Is your data available? Are your materials available? We ask them to include those statements. They can say no, so we're not actually stopping publication, which don't have that. But we recognize this as a stepping stone. We'd like to get to the point where perhaps we could start saying, well, then we're not going to publish your data. But we realize that there might be several years even to get to that point, given that aforementioned issue that people need to do that at the beginning of their projects. But we were concerned that, well, will authors just go somewhere else? And then we've decided that's fine. We want to hold ourselves to the highest standard, because it's critical that moving forward, the people start to recognize that people are calling for this. And it's the best way to get people to change their behavior and researchers to start embracing the open science practices is by almost putting the money on the line, making grant funding contingent on these practices, making publication contingent on these practices. And then we can get not only to the funding issue, which is very critical for gambling studies, but the broader psychological science issues, which is making sure that these studies, you know, some of the issues that Eric talked about in terms of manipulation of results or, you know, practices or analysis techniques that aren't well suited. For example, we do see across different fields, people taking one seminal report that has many stages and slicing it and dicing it into multiple papers that, from the reader's point of view, they'll find one paper and see one set of results. For example, that study you talked about with the 9 or 10 different experiments, that could have been published as 10 different studies. And then it looks really fragmented and you think, great, here's all these 10 different significant results. Instead of seeing what it really is one result where you can find one significant finding and then you can hack it into a different paper, change the sample size a little bit. These sorts of practices become a lot harder to disguise when you're using some of these frameworks.
Thank you. Rachel, Eric, do you have anything to add? And if not, I'll pose a side question. Rachel, no? Eric, was there anything you want to add?
I think that's very thorough. I mean, I'm just happy to see IGS, following suit of a lot of really top journals. I mean, if we look at like Nature and Science, they're really engaging open science practices. I know psychological science, social psychology. So, it's really exciting to see IGS on board with that.
Thanks. There was another question, one by Brittany Keene, who said that there's a lot of talk about funding. That's only one aspect of open science. And can we speak to things like harking and p-hacking and why limiting research degrees of freedom is important? And I think before we get into that, answer that question, I'd like to lead in with a different question. Is that with the replicability crisis, some of the issues that we've noticed is that when there's studies that have low sample size, that they aren't what's called sufficiently statistically powered to do the type of analyses to do the types of analyses that we're doing, that can undermine the ability for that particular effect to be replicated. And before we get into issues like harking, I'd like to ask the panel, and feel free whomever wants to chime in, but are there specific areas within the field of gambling studies that any member of the panel thinks might be on shaky ground? And I'll start off with research that I started doing that really got me into the field of gambling studies, and that's responsible gambling tools and doing lab-based experiments on the efficacy of pop-up messages. And when I look back at some of those studies, they're really low powered, meaning that there's not that many participants in those studies that I ran. And I do wonder about if I were to run some of those studies again with a larger sample size, would I get the same effects? I'll ask Sally, since Sally was in that area, conducted that kind of research as well, what your feeling about that research is, and whether there's other areas of research within the field of gambling studies that you're not that confident in.
Thanks, Michael. And since it's just this cozy little chat of four of us, I can feel comfortable to do some personal disclosure. So at the last UNLV conference in 2019, when we were back allowed in a strange world of traveling, I was chatting with Professor Debbie LaPlante, who, as you've mentioned, is one of the leading scholars in this area, working with Eric. And she said she was really keen to replicate some of these initial lab studies, and that she was going to start with the one that I did as my honours project back in, well, I won't say which date it was. So I completely panicked, thinking of my paper and pencil printed out questionnaires that I had scored and dutifully typed as an honours student into SPSS, thinking, okay, well, I've moved house and countries how many times and computers since that. How on earth am I going to figure out how to even redo that study? So the point is extremely well appreciated. And after calming down, we are actually going to try and replicate that study. In fact, we're in the works at the moment, running it again we've run again using EGMs and skill-based machines with a completely different sample, because it's not just the replication of the studies, which are underpowered, using non-representative samples. Uni students, as we all know, the fodder of psychology, are not even remotely representative of the general population. But it's also the generational effect. What a university student was doing and thought about gambling when I was doing my honours year is quite different to what our more multicultural and tech developed society would have attitudes or responses to gambling now. So the replication effect is so important. And obviously, as we've already pointed out, some of these studies that are underpowered but have seminally influenced our field. Think about Langer's study of illusions of control with uni students walking around with lottery tickets, you know, in the 90s, 60s, and 70s that we're still using today, not only in our research, but at the basis of legislation and what types of gambling you can and cannot have as a legal entity is based on these principles of illusions of control that are so well established and have just been kind of replicated through default, where people just quote Langer, that's accepted, so I'm going to, you know, jump on board that. So, I mean, absolutely, it's important for people to replicate, and then for journals to be able to publish those, because they can be a little bit boring if you want to sort of take that, oh, you know, what does this really add to the field? So it's about getting journals on board to publish these results, including with null findings and non-significant findings, and authors and students to be encouraged to run this sort of thing, which is difficult when you think about the requirements of a typical student project is to do something novel. So to get that novel aspect recognized as including replication, because the lack of it means that the replication now is novel in its own right.
All right, thank you so much. And I'm going to turn over the floor to Rachel in a moment. But I thank you for that. And one of my concerns, well, I've got many concerns about what's going on in the field, but also about funding, which unfortunately, because we only have about 15 minutes left in the session, we're not going to be able to necessarily discuss the growing lack of research funding in the field, and will granting agencies fund replications? We need to educate funding agencies, those that still exist, but also industry that's increasingly funding some of the research in the field of gambling studies. And will industry fund some of these replications? Because I think that it's important, you know, for those in the crowd that are from industry, but also from government, right? That hundreds of millions, millions of dollars is being spent worldwide on safer gambling, responsible gambling initiatives, right? And which is based on research that may or may not be, we may or may not be able to replicate the findings on which those policies are based. And I'll maybe loop back to that after I give the floor to Rachel.
Thanks, Michael. And Sally, I love your example of your honors thesis, because it's exactly the issue that I made a note to myself when I was sort of looking at the questions that Michael circulated and the topics that he wanted us to think about. And I noted to myself that my main concern about replicability has to do with that idea that you cannot step in the same river twice, that as time passes, replicability becomes an issue because the context in which the original study was done has changed. I think about the first problem gambling prevalence survey that I did back in 1986. I mean, there's no way that study could ever be replicated because, it was landline phones and people answered their phones, and, a sample size of 1,000 was considered like enormous. And, that was sort of, it was a small effort at a particular point in time. I replicated the method quite a number of times, and in that sort of same time frame, but it wasn't in New York State. I went on to do the same survey in other states in the U.S. And then it became a question of like what's different in Iowa versus California versus Maryland, when you got different results in terms of gambling behavior. So I do feel like the more time passes, the more complicated it becomes because of how the context has changed, because how gambling has changed, because how the wider society and, and all of the sort of historical changes that happen. How do you sort of acknowledge that, but also try to address it with some kind of replicability?
Yeah, and the issue of context is one of the issues that in the open science community, it's something that's debated, and there's going to be certain research questions that are going to be affected by changing technologies and by changing demographics and just the socio-political contexts, right? Other things shouldn't change. So things like perhaps the effectiveness of a pop-up message, right? One would think, at least at face value, that shouldn't change. However, that being said, I recently published a paper with my PhD student, Samantha Hollingshead, showing that people aren't paying attention to the messages that we gave them, right? That they failed their manipulation check. We argued one reason might be that people are just inundated with pop-up messages nowadays and just ignore them completely. But these have effects. Now, I think more broadly, we need to keep this in mind as hopefully the field of gambling studies moves forward and we start seeing more replications going online, is to not have ad hominem attacks of the researchers where their honors thesis maybe fails to replicate, right? Or, one of my studies fails to replicate. We need to understand the content. Perhaps it's the context that's changed. Perhaps it's that the original study was underpowered. And so we need to start accepting replications and opening up the dialogue about the need for replication, but also what does it mean when a replication fails, right? Was it a direct replication? Probably not. Was it a conceptual replication? What are the differences? And we need to have this discussion. And particularly, I think it's really important that we have this discussion in the field of gambling studies, because what we do, unlike some other fields in science, what we do has direct impact on policies, right? What industry does, what government does, the policies that are made based on our research. And so we need to be having this dialogue, and we need to be having this dialogue with funders and with industry and government, right? Open science is important. Unfortunately, we only have about 8 minutes left, right? So I think we need to start wrapping up the discussion, but I hope that the people out in cyberspace, that we've given some food for thought about how they should be thinking about science when researchers are coming to funders and saying, listen, it's important to replicate X. It's important that, yes, so Sally, Eric, Rachel did this study, 5-6 years ago, but we need to be rerunning that study, maybe with a larger N, to see whether or not these effects are as strong as we originally thought. Maybe they're weaker, maybe they're stronger. And then what do we do? And what is the implication for policy and practice? Maybe with a couple of minutes left, we can just go around the horn and to see if there's anything that the three of you would like to add to the conversation. Unfortunately, as Sally warned me, I had a laundry list of questions that unfortunately we aren't going to be able to get to. So maybe we'll be able to have maybe a second session down the road on these issues, particularly about funding and where funding for gambling research is going to come from, especially if we also need to replicate and if we need to do high-powered, high-end studies in order to have faith, right? That takes time, effort, and a lot of money. And where's that money coming from these days? But maybe we'll start with Rachel, if you have any concluding thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it is a slow process, but, sometimes slow processes start slow and then accelerate. And so I think it's been very interesting to me to sort of look back on this study in Massachusetts, the impact study that I've been running for the last 7 years, and realize that we actually we didn't pre-register our study design back in 2013, but we did publish our original research plan. And so it was there for anybody who wanted to see what we were going to look at to understand what we were proposing to do. Michael, as you're very well aware, since you're a member of our research review committee, all of our reports go through multiple rounds of review and then are published on our website and on the Gaming Commission's website. All of our journal publications, we try to make them open access. And the Gaming Commission has just established an open data exchange where all of our data sets, our code books, our questionnaires, and our reports are available to anybody who wants to get access to them. So, we have sort of been working pretty diligently, I think, to try to move towards open science practices. And I think, I'm feeling motivated now to push it a little bit more.
Thanks, Rachel. And I must say that, yes, I'm on the research review committee for the Massachusetts Gaming Commission, but I applaud Massachusetts for being so open, right? And posting the reports. And I think that other operators should be looking at Massachusetts as perhaps a model of having academics being the one who are reviewing the research. And then when the research is conducted and the report is submitted, that it almost immediately becomes public. And that's part of open science. And I think government and industry, all funders need to sort of come on board with that. I'm getting a cue to wrap up, and maybe we'll have a time for another discussion. I see Khalil has now jumped into the Zoom. So I was going to pose a question to Eric and Sally, but I think I'm being yanked off stage. So I'll pass it along to Khalil, and I'll end by saying thank you for this wonderful conversation, Rachel, Eric, and Sally. And I do hope that there's many, like I said, many questions that I didn't get to ask about funding, and I see questions from the audience about researcher bias. I think that there seems to be a thirst for an extended discussion about these issues, and maybe we can return to this nearing the end of the summer. So thank you all.
Well, and thank you very much, Michael, for leading our discussion. And thank you, Eric, Rachel, and Sally, of course, for participating in the discussion. Since this work from home lifestyle has begun, I have found myself on the short end of a very, very intense Michael Wohl rant about the state of academia, and this fully satisfied that need. And I'm glad that everybody else was able to experience it as well. So thank you very much for that. So next week we have another interesting conversation that we hope that you can all join us for. Next week we're actually going to be talking about a responsible gambling tool. I know that came up today as part of the conversation, but we'll be talking about customized messaging. And the conversation might meander a little bit from that, but I think we're going to get into some really good applied discussion. So if you have any interest at all in that topic or RG in general, please do tune in. We have a very young emerging researcher coming on, as well as a very experienced person who has been working in the industry, but is also a researcher. So tune in for that. And like I mentioned at the opening, if you have any ideas for a lightning round ECR talk, please send those our way, as well as we're always interested in hearing about new topic ideas. Sally and I have gone through our Rolodex a few different times to try to come up with interesting conversations to have. And it seems that we're going to have to keep broadcasting these talks for several months more. So we have lots of room to hear interesting talks. So please send those through. So with that, thank you to our speakers again, and we'll see you all again next